The screaming stopped at exactly 2:47 p.m., and Maya Chen knew that silence meant something far worse than chaos. She crouched behind the overturned coffee cart in the main concourse of Union Station, her hands still trembling from the crash of ceramic mugs that had shattered against the marble floor just minutes earlier. The familiar weight of the coffee urn's metal handle pressed against her palm, cold now, like everything else in this moment that had turned her ordinary Tuesday into a nightmare. Through the gaps between the cart's wheels, she could see polished black boots moving in formation, hear the sharp bark of commands in a language she didn't recognize, and smell something that didn't belong in a place that usually carried the comforting aromas of fresh pastries and morning brew: gunpowder and fear. If you're enjoying this incredible story of courage under pressure, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories like this one. 6 months ago, Maya had been Sergeant Maya Chen, United States Marine Corps, specialist in tactical weapons assembly and close-quarters combat. She could strip and rebuild an M4 carbine blindfolded in 14 seconds, had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, and carried commendations that meant something in a world where military training separated the living from the dead. But that was before the incident in Kandahar, before the nightmares started coming every night like clockwork, before her hands began shaking so badly during weapons maintenance that her commanding officer suggested she might benefit from some time to reassess her priorities. Now she was just Maya of the coffee lady, the quiet woman who knew everyone's order by heart and never asked questions when Detective Rodriguez needed his 4th espresso of the morning, or when Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop wanted to pay for her latte with exact change counted out in pennies. The other vendors in Union Station had grown accustomed to her precision, the way she measured each shot of espresso with mathematical accuracy, how she arranged her supplies with military efficiency, the fact that she arrived at 5:30 a.m. every morning and left at exactly 6 p.m., never a minute early or late. They didn't know about the medals in her apartment drawer, the discharge papers that used words like honorable and psychological evaluation recommended, or the way she chose this job specifically because the routine kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. But routines had a way of shattering, just like the coffee cups now scattered across the station floor in glittering fragments that caught the afternoon light streaming through the great arched windows. "Everyone down, now!" The voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling, amplified by acoustics designed to carry the gentle murmur of travelers and the soft announcements of departing trains. Maya recognized the tone immediately. Military training, possibly special forces, definitely foreign. She pressed herself lower against the cart, her muscle memory automatically cataloging the sounds around her. 8, maybe 10 attackers based on footfall patterns, coordinated movement suggesting professional training, weapons that sounded like automatic rifles from the sharp percussion of warning shots fired into the air. Through the chaos, she could hear other sounds that made her stomach clench with recognition. Mrs. Patterson was crying somewhere near the flower stand, a soft, desperate sound that reminded Maya of the civilians in the marketplace in Helmand Province. Detective Rodriguez's radio was crackling with urgent dispatcher codes, though she couldn't see him from her position. And underneath it all, the controlled breathing of people trying to stay invisible, trying to survive, the sound that had haunted her dreams for months. The coffee cart that now served as her shield was decorated with hand-painted sunflowers, a detail she'd always found absurdly cheerful for the sometimes grim environment of urban transit. She'd bought it from an elderly Italian man named Giuseppe, who'd run the coffee stand for 37 years before deciding he wanted to spend his remaining time with his grandchildren in Sicily. He'd insisted on teaching her his espresso technique, standing behind her for hours during those first weeks, his weathered hands guiding hers as she learned to read the pressure gauges and timing mechanisms that made the difference between bitter disappointment and perfect extraction.
"The coffee, she speaks to you," Giuseppe had said in his heavily accented English, tapping his temple with one finger. But you must listen with more than your ears, you understand? With your heart, with your hands, with the part of you that knows when something is exactly right. Maya had thought it was simply an old man's romantic nonsense, until she realized he was describing something she already understood, the same intuitive precision that had made her an exceptional marksman, the ability to feel when all the variables aligned perfectly. Now, those same hands that had mastered Giuseppe's espresso rituals were pressed flat against the cold metal of the cart, and she could feel her pulse hammering against her wrists. The attackers were moving methodically through the station, herding people toward the main waiting area. She caught glimpses of terrified faces, commuters who'd been checking train schedules, tourists studying maps, station employees who'd been going about their ordinary duties when ordinary became impossible. 237 people, she whispered to herself, a habit from her military days of automatically assessing civilian populations in potential combat zones. She'd been unconsciously counting the flow of people through the station for months, noting peak hours and crowd patterns. It was information that had seemed useless until now, when it might be the difference between a successful rescue operation and a massacre. The leader of the attackers, she could identify him by the way the others deferred to his movements, was speaking into a radio or phone in rapid, clipped sentences. Maya strained to catch words, drawing on the language training that had been part of her military education. Russian, she thought, or possibly Chechen. The syntax was familiar from intelligence briefings she had attended in her previous life, when her expertise was valued and her opinions mattered in rooms where life and death decisions were made by people who understood that sometimes violence was the only answer to violence. A child started crying somewhere in the growing crowd of hostages, a sound that cut through Maya's carefully constructed emotional barriers like a blade through tissue paper. She closed her eyes and saw another child in another place in another time when her split-second decision had meant the difference between catastrophe and salvation. But that memory led to other memories, to the incident that had ended her career and started her nightmares, to the reason why her hands shook when she tried to hold a weapon now. The coffee cart's inventory was scattered around her. Bags of premium beans from Guatemala and Ethiopia, the small bottles of flavoring syrups Giuseppe had insisted were essential to proper customer service, packages of paper cups printed with the Union Station logo, and the cash box that contained exactly $347.83 from the day's sales. Normal things from a normal life that now seemed as fragile and temporary as the steam that rose from fresh espresso on a cold morning. But there was something else behind the cart, something Maya had forgotten in the chaos of the last few minutes. Giuseppe had left more than coffee-making equipment when he'd sold her the business. In the locked metal storage compartment underneath the main counter, wrapped in an old canvas tarp and secured with a combination lock set to his daughter's birthday, he'd left what he'd called his insurance policy, a disassembled hunting rifle that he'd kept for protection during the early morning hours when he'd worked alone in the station. "You never know," he'd told her on his last day, pressing the combination into her palm. "Sometimes the world she becomes crazy, and you need more than good coffee to keep people safe." Maya's fingers found the lock almost involuntarily, her muscle memory engaging even as her conscious mind recoiled from what she was considering. 7/15/1952. The date tumbled through the mechanism with a soft click, and the metal door swung open to reveal the rifle components nestled in their protective wrapping like pieces of a deadly puzzle waiting to be solved. The sounds around her were changing. The attackers had finished their sweep of the station and were beginning to make demands. She could hear the leader speaking more loudly now, his voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone who wanted to be recorded, who had a message for an audience beyond the terrified people gathered in the waiting area. This was planned, political, designed for maximum impact, the kind of operation that would end in tragedy unless someone intervened. Maya's hands moved toward the rifle components, then stopped. The last time she had assembled a weapon under pressure, people had died. Not the enemy. The mission had been a technical success, but the cost of that success had been higher than anyone had anticipated.
Weight of those consequences had followed her home from the desert, settling into her dreams like sand that could never be fully washed away. The child was still crying, and now other voices were joining in. Pleas for mercy, questions asked in a dozen languages, the universal human response to fear and helplessness. 237 people who had started their day expecting nothing more dramatic than catching a train or buying a sandwich, who were now depending on law enforcement response protocols that Maya knew from experience took time to organize properly. Time that might not be available. She lifted the first component from the case, the receiver group, cold and familiar in her hands. Even after 6 months of deliberately avoiding anything connected to her military service, her fingers remembered the exact pressure points and alignment requirements. Giuseppe's rifle was older than her service weapon, a bolt-action design that favored accuracy over rate of fire. But the principles were universal. Metal spoke to metal in the same language across all makes and models, a conversation she'd been fluent in since basic training. The second piece, the barrel assembly, heavier than she remembered, solid in a way that reminded her why firearms had changed the trajectory of human history. This was technology designed for a single purpose, refined over centuries of conflict into something that could project lethal force across distances that separated safety from danger, life from death. Third piece, the bolt mechanism, the heart of the weapon's function, the component that would transform stored potential energy into kinetic reality. Her hands were steadier now, the familiar routine overriding the anxiety that had been her constant companion for months. This was something she knew how to do, something she'd been trained for in a world that demanded perfection, because second chances were luxuries that combat rarely provided. Fourth piece, the stock and trigger assembly, the interface between human intention and mechanical result. Maya had always found it grimly poetic that this was the part of the weapon that required the most personal contact, the place where human decision became irreversible action. Fifth piece, the scope, precision optics that would turn rough estimates into exact calculations. Giuseppe had invested in quality here, a variable power lens that could adapt to changing circumstances, just like the people who used such equipment. The components were arranged in front of her now, like pieces of a familiar song waiting to be played. Maya knew she could assemble them in less than 15 seconds. It was a skill that had been drilled into her through repetition until it became as automatic as breathing. But knowing she could do something and deciding she should do something were different questions entirely, questions that carried different weights and different consequences. Around her, the crisis was escalating. She could hear the attackers making demands that sounded rehearsed, political statements that suggested this was about more than money or random violence. Someone was documenting the scene. She caught the electronic whine of video equipment, the kind of sound that meant this was being broadcast or recorded for later distribution. A propaganda operation, designed to send a message to audiences far beyond Union Station. Maya closed her eyes and made a decision that would either save lives or cost them, depending on whether the woman she used to be could still function despite the woman she'd become. Her hands began to move. The alarm clock in Maya's studio apartment had been ringing at 4:45 a.m. every weekday for exactly 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. She knew this because she'd been counting, the same way she counted steps from her bed to the bathroom. 17. The number of coffee beans she used per cup, exactly 18 for a single espresso, and the precise amount of milk foam that created the perfect cappuccino crown. 2 tablespoons, heated to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Numbers had become her anchor in a world that no longer made the kind of sense it used to make when she wore a uniform and carried a rifle with the authority of the United States government behind every decision.
The morning routine never varied. Shower, precisely 7 minutes of hot water that turned lukewarm at the end because the building's boiler couldn't maintain pressure past 6 a.m. Teeth brushed for exactly 2 minutes with circular motions that her military dentist had demonstrated during a hygiene inspection 8 years ago. Hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail that fit under a helmet, or, more recently, under the cheerful yellow cap that Giuseppe had insisted was part of the coffee cart's brand identity. Breakfast was always the same. 2 pieces of whole wheat toast, one with peanut butter, one with strawberry jam, and a cup of coffee made with the same beans she sold at the station. She tried varying the routine in her first weeks of civilian life, but discovered that too many choices in the morning led to a cascade of small anxieties that accumulated throughout the day like snow gathering on a mountainside before an avalanche. The apartment itself was a study in deliberate simplicity. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and dining room, with an efficiency kitchen that consisted of a 2-burner stove, a small refrigerator, and exactly enough cabinet space for the basics. No television, because the news made her hands shake. No radio, because music reminded her of the recreation tent in Kandahar where soldiers would gather to pretend they were somewhere else. The only decorations were a single photograph of her parents at their 25th wedding anniversary and a small succulent plant that required water exactly once per week. The commute to Union Station was a 20-minute walk through neighborhoods that were slowly gentrifying, past coffee shops that charged 3 times what Maya did for drinks that weren't necessarily better, just served in an atmosphere that catered to people who had never learned to find comfort in routine. She always took the same route, left on Henderson Street, right on Commonwealth Avenue, straight for 12 blocks until the grand facade of Union Station rose before her like a cathedral dedicated to the movement of people and the possibility of escape. He was shorter than Maya had expected from their phone conversation, with hands that showed the wear of manual labor and eyes that suggested he understood more about the world than he typically shared. "You are the soldier," he'd said. Not a question, but a statement delivered in his musical accent. "Giuseppe Marcelli. We spoke yesterday about the coffee business." "Former soldier," Maya had corrected, though she wasn't sure why the distinction seemed important. "Ah, no," Giuseppe had smiled, wiping his hands on a towel that smelled like cinnamon and espresso. "There is no such thing as former soldier. Only soldier who is doing different job today." The training had been more comprehensive than Maya had expected. Giuseppe approached coffee making with the same methodical precision that the Marine Corps had brought to weapons maintenance. Every variable mattered: water temperature, grind consistency, tamping pressure, extraction timing. The difference between adequate coffee and exceptional coffee, he explained, was the same as the difference between completing a mission and completing a mission perfectly. Both might achieve the objective, but only one would be remembered with respect. "The customers, they think they want coffee," Giuseppe said during her second week, watching her practice the ritualistic dance of espresso preparation. "But what they really want is to feel understood, to know that someone pays attention to the details that matter to them.
Mrs. Patterson, she wants her latte extra hot because her arthritis makes her hands cold. Detective Rodriguez, he needs his coffee strong because he works double shifts and has 3 children who keep him awake at night. The businessman with the expensive briefcase, he wants his cappuccino dry because he is diabetic but too proud to ask for sugar-free syrup. Maya had initially dismissed this as an old man sentimentality, but gradually she began to notice the patterns Giuseppe described. Regular customers who arrived at precise times, who had specific preferences that went beyond simple taste to encompass ritual and comfort. People who needed their morning coffee to be one predictable element in lives that were otherwise subject to the chaos of urban existence, job pressures, family complications, and the 1,000 small disappointments that accumulated like sediment in the bottom of a cup. Detective Rodriguez had been her first real regular. He'd approached the cart during her 3rd week with the careful wariness of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats, ordered
A simple black coffee, and then lingered longer than necessary while studying her face with professional interest. "You're new," he'd observed, though it wasn't really a question. "Giuseppe retired," Maya had replied, focusing on the coffee preparation to avoid extended eye contact. "Military?" Maya's hands had paused for just a moment before resuming their measured routine. "What makes you ask?" "Posture, haircut, the way you scan the crowd every 30 seconds like you're looking for potential problems?" Rodriguez had accepted his coffee with a nod that suggested approval rather than suspicion. "Marines?" "Former Marines." "No such thing as a former Marine," Rodriguez had said with a slight smile. "Just Marines doing different jobs." The conversation had ended there, but Rodriguez had returned the next morning, and the morning after that, until his visits became part of the rhythm that defined Maya's new existence. He never pushed for personal information, never asked direct questions about her service or the reasons behind her career change, but he always left a larger tip than necessary and occasionally shared small pieces of information about station security that might be useful for someone running a business in a public space. Mrs. Patterson had required a different approach. She appeared during Maya's 2nd month, a woman in her 70s who moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain, carrying a worn leather purse and wearing sweaters that suggested she'd been beautiful once and still maintained the habits of someone who cared about appearances. Her first order had been specific, to the point of being demanding: a small latte with whole milk, extra foam, served at exactly 140 degrees, stirred clockwise 3 times before serving. Maya had initially been irritated by the precise requirements, but Giuseppe pulled her aside afterward with a gentle correction. Mrs. Patterson's husband, he died 2 years ago, cancer. For 43 years, he made her coffee every morning exactly the way she liked it. Now she comes here because we are the only place that takes the time to do it right, the way he would have done it. Understanding arrived like a sudden shift in weather. Mrs. Patterson wasn't being demanding. She was preserving a connection to love that had been lost, maintaining a ritual that kept memory alive in the form of perfectly prepared coffee. Maya began to approach the order with the same reverence she might have brought to handling a flag at a military funeral, recognizing that some requests carried weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. The businessman with the expensive briefcase had been more challenging. He arrived exactly at 7:23 a.m. every weekday, ordered the same dry cappuccino, and paid with a corporate credit card while conducting phone conversations that seemed to involve large sums of money and small amounts of human consideration. Maya had initially categorized him as the kind of person she'd learned to avoid during her military service, someone who viewed other people as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. But Giuseppe had taught her to look deeper, to notice the details that revealed character beneath appearances. The businessman's shoes were expensive, but showed signs of being resold multiple times rather than replaced. His briefcase was genuine leather, but worn at the corners in a way that suggested years of daily use. His phone conversations, when Maya actually listened to the content rather than the tone, often involved him advocating for employees who were facing layoffs or budget cuts. People are complicated, Giuseppe had observed one morning after the businessman had left. Sometimes, the person who seems most cold is actually the person who cares so much that they have to build walls to protect themselves from feeling too much pain when they cannot fix everything they see wrong in the world. These observations had gradually transformed Maya's relationship with the work from simple customer service to something approaching anthropological study. Each regular customer became a character in an ongoing narrative, their coffee preferences serving as windows into lives that intersected with hers for a few minutes each day before diverging into experiences she could only imagine.
The routine had been therapeutic in ways that the VA counselors had never been able to explain adequately. The precision required for perfect coffee preparation satisfied the same part of her mind that had found comfort in military protocols. The human interaction was limited and structured, allowing her to practice social engagement without the overwhelming unpredictability that had made civilian relationships so difficult. And the work itself was constructive rather than destructive, creating small moments of pleasure rather than preparing for scenarios that might require taking lives. But therapy, Maya had learned, was different from healing. The nightmare still came with clockwork regularity, usually around 3:17 a.m., filling her apartment with the echoes of gunfire and the weight of decisions that had seemed clear in the moment but had grown more complicated with distance and time. Her hand still shook when she tried to hold anything heavier than a coffee cup, still trembled when unexpected sounds reminded her of combat situations where reflexes had meant the difference between survival and casualty reports. The incident in Kandahar followed her through her days like a shadow that grew longer as the sun set. She'd been part of a convoy security detail, providing overwatch for a humanitarian mission in a district that intelligence had classified as generally secure with isolated pockets of insurgent activity. The kind of military euphemism that meant anything could happen, but probably wouldn't, until it did. The improvised explosive device had been professionally constructed, placed with tactical precision, and detonated with timing that suggested the attackers had been watching the convoy's route for days or weeks. Maya had been positioned on a rooftop 3 blocks away, providing sniper support for the Marines conducting house-to-house searches for weapons caches, when the world had suddenly filled with smoke and screaming, and the particular chaos that combat veterans learned to recognize as the sound of everything going wrong simultaneously. Through her scope, she'd seen the secondary attack developing, insurgents moving through the residential buildings, using civilian cover to position themselves for an ambush that would have turned a manageable crisis into a massacre. Her orders had been clear: neutralize the threat, protect the convoy, minimize civilian casualties. Standard rules of engagement that she'd followed dozens of times in similar situations. But this time, the calculus had been more complicated. The insurgents weren't just using civilian buildings for cover, they were using civilian people. Children, elderly residents, families who'd been trapped in their homes when the fighting started. Maya had been trained to make split-second decisions based on the best available information, to act when action was required and accept the consequences when perfect solutions weren't possible. She'd taken the shot, then another, then a third that had stopped the ambush and saved the lives of 17 Marines who would have walked into a carefully prepared killing field. The after-action reports had been clear in their assessment. Maya's intervention had prevented a catastrophic loss of American lives and had been conducted according to all applicable rules of engagement. The insurgents she'd killed had been armed combatants engaged in hostile action against U.S. forces. Her actions had been legally justified, tactically sound, and professionally executed.
But the reports hadn't mentioned the 11-year-old girl who had been standing in the wrong doorway at the wrong time, who'd been close enough to one of Maya's targets that the kinetic energy transfer had been sufficient to cause fatal injuries, despite the fact that Maya had never intended to harm her, had never even seen her until the tactical debrief revealed what had happened in those crucial seconds when decisions had to be made faster than conscience could fully process the implications. The girl's name was Aisha. Maya had learned this from the casualty report, along with details that transformed statistics into humanity. She had been the youngest of 4 children, had been learning to read English from a picture book that American soldiers had given her during a previous patrol, and had dreamed of becoming a teacher like her mother. Information that served
Tactical purpose, but carried emotional weight that proved more difficult to carry than any equipment Maya had been issued during her military service. The nightmares had started 3 weeks after the incident. Initially just occasional disruptions that could be managed with additional coffee and determination, but gradually they had become more frequent, more vivid, more insistent in their demand that Maya relive those moments when her training had worked exactly as designed and the results had been more complicated than training could account for. The final evaluation had been conducted by a military psychiatrist who spoke in the careful language of someone who understood the bureaucratic implications of every word choice. Maya's service record was exemplary. Her psychological profile showed stress indicators consistent with normal combat exposure. Her tactical decision-making remained sound. However, her current symptoms suggested she might benefit from a period of readjustment to civilian life, during which she could process her experiences in a non-military environment and develop coping strategies that would serve her well in either future military service or civilian career paths. Honorable discharge, full benefits, letter of recommendation from her commanding officer that described her as one of the finest Marines it has been my privilege to serve with. Everything necessary to transition successfully to civilian life, except for the ability to hold a weapon without remembering the weight of consequences that followed precision under pressure. Giuseppe had never asked about her military service directly, but he'd noticed the way her hands trembled when she tried to carry too many cups at once, the way she instinctively positioned herself where she could see all approaches to the coffee cart, the way she sometimes paused in the middle of routine tasks as if listening for sounds that others couldn't hear. "The war, she follows soldiers home sometimes," he'd said one quiet afternoon when the station was nearly empty and Maya had been struggling to keep her hands steady while cleaning the espresso machine. "My father, he fought in the big war, came back to Italy with eyes that saw things the rest of us never had to see. He said the hardest part was not the fighting, was learning how to live in a world where people thought coffee was the most important crisis of their morning." Maya had wanted to ask Giuseppe more about his father, about how someone learned to bridge the gap between military necessity and civilian normalcy, but the conversation had been interrupted by the arrival of the evening commuter rush. Later, when the opportunity might have returned, she discovered that some questions were easier to leave unasked than to risk hearing answers that might not provide the comfort she was seeking. The coffee cart had become her compromise with a world that seemed to require more social interaction than she was prepared to handle, but less isolation than would be healthy for someone trying to rebuild a functional relationship with humanity. Her customers expected nothing from her except competent service and basic courtesy. Her responsibilities were clearly defined and limited in scope. Her success could be measured in objective terms: customer satisfaction, daily revenue, equipment maintenance, inventory management. But even this carefully constructed simplicity had been disrupted by gradual complications that seemed to accumulate despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance. Mrs. Patterson had begun lingering after receiving her coffee, sharing stories about her late husband and asking gentle questions about Maya's life that suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. Detective Rodriguez had started including her in casual conversations about station security, treating her as a colleague rather than simply another vendor. Even the businessman with the expensive briefcase had begun acknowledging her with nods that suggested recognition of her competence and reliability. Relationships, Maya had discovered, developed their own momentum, regardless of whether they were actively encouraged. People who saw each other regularly began to care about each other's welfare, to notice changes in mood or behavior, to offer assistance when circumstances required it. The social contracts that governed daily interaction gradually evolved into something resembling friendship, whether or not the participants had consciously agreed to such evolution. This had been the most unexpected challenge of civilian life. Learning to accept kindness from people who didn't know about her military service, who had no obligation to support her readjustment process, who simply offered human connection because that was what people did when they shared space and time and the small rituals that made urban existence tolerable.
Giuseppe had been the most direct in his expressions of concern and support. During her 4th month at the coffee cart, when Maya's nightmares had been particularly severe and her hands had been shaking badly enough to affect her work performance, he had arrived at the station early and found her sitting on the floor behind the cart, trying to assemble the espresso machine components that had somehow become impossible for her to manage. "Come," he'd said, pulling up a second chair. "We practice the easy things until the hard things become easy again." They'd spent the morning working through basic motor skills exercises disguised as equipment maintenance. Giuseppe had shown her breathing techniques that he claimed were essential for proper coffee preparation, but which Maya recognized as meditation practices designed to manage anxiety. He'd shared stories about his early days learning the coffee business from his father, emphasizing the mistakes and learning process rather than the expertise that had eventually developed. "Competence," he'd said, while guiding her hands through the precise motions required for proper espresso tamping, "is not something you possess permanently. Is something you practice every day, like playing music or staying strong. Some days the practice is easier, some days it's harder. But you keep practicing because the alternative is to forget how to do the things that matter." Maya had wanted to tell him about Kandahar, about Aisha, about the weight of precision that had saved 17 lives and cost one that hadn't been part of the tactical equation. But the words had seemed inadequate to bridge the gap between military necessity and civilian understanding, between the world where such decisions were required and the world where coffee was the most serious crisis most people faced before lunch. Instead, she'd focused on the rhythm of Giuseppe's instruction, the way his hands moved with unconscious expertise, the patience he showed when her attempts fell short of his standards. It wasn't therapy in any formal sense, but it was healing in the way that shared competence could be healing, allowing her to rebuild confidence in her ability to perform precise tasks under pressure without the consequences that had made such precision feel like a burden rather than a skill. The morning routine had gradually stabilized around these sessions with Giuseppe, even after he'd officially retired and turned the business over to her. He continued to arrive early several days per week, ostensibly to help with equipment maintenance or inventory management, but actually to provide the kind of steady presence that Maya hadn't realized she'd been missing since leaving the structured environment of military service. Now, crouched behind that same coffee cart, while armed men controlled Union Station, and over 200 people, or the hostages, in subsequent mentions, waited to learn whether they would survive the day, Maya understood that Giuseppe's rifle components were more than just an insurance policy.
They were a test of whether the woman she used to be could coexist with the woman she'd become. Whether the skills that had once cost her nightmares might now be the price of preventing other people's tragedies. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in months. The first shot that wasn't a warning came at 3:03 p.m., and Maya knew from the sound, the sharp crack of a high-velocity round followed by the wet impact of bullet meeting flesh, that someone had decided the negotiations weren't proceeding according to plan. She'd been listening to the back and forth between the attackers and what she assumed were federal negotiators for the past 16 minutes, her military-trained ear automatically parsing the tactical communication patterns, even though the conversations were taking place in multiple languages. The attackers were Russian, she'd confirmed by now, but their English was fluent enough to handle complex political demands. They wanted the release of 6 specific prisoners from federal custody, safe passage to an airport, and guaranteed transport to a non-extradition country. Standard terrorist playbook, the kind of operation that usually ended in either complete capitulation by authorities or a violent resolution that left hostages as casualty statistics. But someone in the crowd of hostages had apparently decided they weren't willing to wait for the outcome of those negotiations. Maya heard the scuffle first, the sound of someone moving suddenly, the sharp intake of breath that preceded desperate action, a woman's voice saying, "No, don't," before the gunshot cut through whatever heroic gesture was being attempted. Then screaming, real screaming that carried the particular pitch of people witnessing violence at close range, and the harsh commands of attackers reasserting control over a situation that had momentarily slipped away from their careful choreography. "Anyone else wants to be hero?" The leader's voice carried clearly across the station's marble floors, his accent thickening with anger. "Next person moves without permission, we shoot 3 people instead of 1. You understand this mathematics?" Maya closed her eyes and counted to 10 in the measured cadence that her combat instructors had taught her for maintaining psychological equilibrium under stress. 1 person was already dead. She could hear the wet rattling sound of lungs trying to process air through blood, could identify the gradual cessation of movement that meant someone's husband or wife or parent had become a casualty of someone else's political statement. But her emotional response to that tragedy had to be secondary to her tactical assessment of how the situation had changed and what options remained for preventing additional casualties. The rifle components were still arranged in front of her like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Giuseppe's hunting rifle, precision crafted for long-distance accuracy, chambered in .308 Winchester with a variable scope that could adapt to targets from 50 yards to half a mile. Maya's hands hovered over the parts while her mind ran through the calculations that had once been automatic. Range estimation, wind assessment, target priority, collateral damage potential. Range would be approximately 120 yards from her position behind the coffee cart to the main waiting area where the hostages were being held. Wind was negligible inside the enclosed station. Target priority would depend on tactical positioning and threat assessment. She'd need to identify the leader and any supporting personnel who could maintain operational control if the primary target was neutralized. Collateral damage potential was the complicated variable, the factor that had haunted her dreams for 6 months and would haunt them forever if she made the wrong decision today. Through the gaps in the coffee cart structure, Maya could see fragments of the scene playing out in the station's central area. The attackers had positioned themselves with military precision, controlling the primary entrances and establishing overlapping fields of fire that would make any frontal assault by law enforcement prohibitively costly. They'd separated the hostages into 3 groups: adults against the north wall, children and elderly against the east wall, station employees near the ticket counters. Classic terrorist tactics designed to complicate rescue operations and maximize psychological pressure on negotiators. The leader was a tall man in his 30s, moving with the controlled aggression of someone accustomed to violence as a problem-solving tool. Maya could see enough of his profile to note the facial scarring that suggested combat experience, the way he held his weapon with professional familiarity, the manner in which he scanned the environment with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that survival depended on constant threat assessment. His supporting personnel, Maya counted 7 additional attackers, were positioned to provide mutual support while maintaining independent fields of fire. 2 near the main entrance, two covering the platform access, one monitoring the administrative offices, one positioned for overwatch of the hostage groups, and one who seemed to be handling communications and documentation. Professional deployment that suggested military or paramilitary training, possibly special forces background. Maya's tactical assessment was interrupted by the sound of Detective Rodriguez's voice, carrying clearly enough for her to understand that he was trying to establish communication with the attackers. Rodriguez was apparently among the hostages in the adult group, and his law enforcement training was compelling him to attempt de-escalation, despite the obvious risks of drawing attention to himself. "Listen, nobody else needs to get hurt," Rodriguez was saying, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone trained in crisis negotiation. "We all want to go home to our families today. You've made your point, demonstrated your capabilities. Now let's talk about how we resolve this peacefully." The leader's response was immediate and brutal. Maya heard the sound of a rifle butt connecting with flesh, followed by Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath and the dull impact of a body hitting marble floor. Then the leader's voice, speaking in accented English that carried across the station like a pronouncement of divine judgment.
"Police stay quiet or police die first," he announced. "We are not here for talking. We are here for justice. American government will learn that actions have consequences, that innocent people in other countries also have families they want to see again." Maya's hands moved toward the rifle components, almost involuntarily. She'd worked with Rodriguez for 4 months, had learned to appreciate his steady professionalism and dry humor, had watched him navigate the complex human dynamics of urban law enforcement with patience and integrity. He was bleeding somewhere in that crowd of hostages, possibly seriously injured, definitely unable to provide the kind of tactical response that might normally be expected from law enforcement personnel caught in such situations. But Maya's military training insisted on objective assessment over emotional response. Rodriguez was one person among 237. His injury was regrettable, but not strategically significant, unless it indicated a change in the attacker's operational parameters. What mattered was whether his attempt at communication had provided useful intelligence about terrorist motivations and tactical capabilities. The leader's reference to innocent people in other countries suggested this was retaliation for American foreign policy decisions, possibly connected to recent military operations in Eastern Europe or Central Asia. The professional nature of the operation indicated state sponsorship, or at least support from organizations with access to military-grade equipment and training. And the emphasis on justice, rather than simple ransom demands, meant the attackers were prepared to accept significant casualties in pursuit of their political objectives. Maya began assembling the rifle. Her hands moved with muscle memory that overrode 6 months of deliberate avoidance, each component clicking into place with the satisfying precision of machinery designed for a single purpose. The receiver group locked onto the stock assembly with the solid engagement of metal parts manufactured to tolerances measured in thousands of inches. The barrel slid into position with the smooth resistance of precision engineering, the threading engaging with the exact pressure required for optimal accuracy at extended ranges. The bolt mechanism was next, the heart of the weapon's function sliding into place with the familiar weight of steel components designed to withstand the explosive forces generated by controlled chemical reactions. Maya's fingers found the timing marks automatically, aligning the mechanical elements with the unconscious competence of someone who had performed this operation hundreds of times under conditions ranging from routine maintenance to combat urgency. The scope mounted with the satisfying click of precision optics engaging their mounting system. Giuseppe had invested in quality here, Leupold glass with variable magnification and parallax adjustment, the kind of scope that could adapt to changing tactical requirements while maintaining the optical clarity necessary for precision shooting at extended ranges. Maya's eye found the sight picture automatically, her cheeks settling against the stock with the natural alignment that separated competent marksmen from exceptional ones.
But it was the magazine that gave her pause. Giuseppe had left the rifle unloaded, as was proper for any responsible firearms owner. But he'd also left a full box of .308 Winchester ammunition in the storage compartment. Military-grade ammunition, she noticed, not the soft-point hunting rounds that would be typical for civilian use. Full metal jacket projectiles, designed for maximum penetration and reliable terminal ballistics. The kind of ammunition that was intended for use against human targets rather than game animals. Maya's hands trembled as she loaded the magazine, each cartridge sliding into place with the metallic whisper of brass against steel. 5 rounds, each one representing a potential decision that could save lives or cost them, depending on her ability to make tactical assessments under pressure, without allowing emotional factors to compromise her judgment. The completed rifle felt familiar in her hands, like returning to a conversation that had been interrupted rather than ended. The weight distribution was different from her military weapon. Heavier barrel, different balance point, manual rather than semi-automatic action. But the essential relationship between human operator and precision instrument remained unchanged. This was technology designed to project lethal force across distances that separated safety from danger, to allow human decision-making to influence events beyond the reach of hands or voices.
Maya took a deep breath and evaluated her tactical situation with the methodical thoroughness that had once made her an asset to units operating in hostile territory. She had clear line of sight to most of the station's central area, adequate concealment behind the coffee cart, and sufficient elevation to minimize the risk of collateral damage from missed shots. Her field of fire encompassed the primary target area while avoiding the hostage groups that had been positioned with apparent consideration for preventing exactly the kind of intervention she was contemplating. The attackers had made tactical errors that suggested they were prepared for conventional law enforcement response, but hadn't anticipated the possibility of trained opposition from unexpected quarters. Their positioning was designed to control obvious approach routes and dominant terrain features, but they'd failed to secure potential sniper positions in the station's secondary areas. The coffee car's location provided cover and concealment that they dismissed as irrelevant because it was outside their primary operational zone. Maya's military training identified these oversights automatically, but her civilian conscience insisted on more complicated questions. Was she legally justified in using lethal force against people who hadn't directly threatened her? Did her military oath require her to take action when American citizens were in danger even though she was no longer on active duty? What were the chances that her intervention would improve the situation rather than escalate it beyond the capabilities of law enforcement to control? These questions were interrupted by the sound of renewed violence from the hostage area. Someone else had apparently violated the attacker's behavioral requirements, and their response was immediate and disproportionate. Maya heard the distinctive sound of automatic gunfire. 3 quick bursts had echoed through the station's vaulted ceiling like thunder in a cathedral. Then silence that was somehow more disturbing than the screaming that had preceded it. "This is the cost of disobedience," the leader announced, his voice carrying across the marble floors with the theatrical quality of someone who understood that fear was as much a weapon as the rifle in his hands. "American government thinks they can act without consequences in other countries. Today you learn what consequences feel like." Maya closed her eyes and saw Aisha again, the 11-year-old girl who had died because Maya's tactical decisions had been correct but incomplete, who had become the price of precision under pressure when precision alone wasn't sufficient to prevent tragedy. But she also saw Rodriguez bleeding somewhere in that crowd, Mrs. Patterson probably terrified beyond her ability to cope, children who would carry the memory of this day for the rest of their lives regardless of how it ended. The scope's crosshairs found the leader's profile through the gaps in the coffee cart structure. Range, approximately 122 yards. Wind, negligible. Target, stationary, unaware of being observed, positioned for maximum tactical impact with minimal collateral damage potential. Shot probability, high, assuming Maya's skills hadn't deteriorated significantly during 6 months of civilian life. But taking the shot would mean crossing a line that she'd been trying to avoid since leaving military service. It would mean accepting responsibility for consequences that extended beyond her immediate survival, choosing to use lethal force based on her own tactical assessment rather than following orders from properly constituted authority. It would mean becoming the person she used to be, with all the capabilities and responsibilities that identity entailed. Maya's finger found the trigger with the familiar pressure of metal against flesh, the interface between human decision and mechanical result. The rifle was loaded, aimed, and ready to fulfill its design purpose. All that remained was her choice to engage the safety mechanism of her own conscience and accept the weight of consequences that would follow precision under pressure. The station's great clock showed 3:17 p.m. when Maya made her decision. But before she could engage the trigger, the tactical situation changed in ways that rendered her careful calculations irrelevant. The station's main entrance erupted in a coordinated explosion of smoke, noise, and rapid movement as federal tactical teams initiated their assault. Flashbang grenades detonated with the characteristic crack thump that was designed to temporarily incapacitate anyone within the blast radius, filling the air with white smoke and disorienting sound.
The attackers' response was immediate and professional. They'd been prepared for exactly this scenario, and their reaction suggested military training that included experience with counter-assault operations. The leader barked commands in Russian while his team moved to predetermined positions that maximized their defensive capabilities while maintaining lethal control over the hostage groups. But Maya realized, with the tactical clarity that came from observing combat operations from an unexpected vantage point, that the federal assault team had made the same miscalculation that the attackers had made. They were prepared to engage trained opposition in a conventional tactical scenario, but they hadn't anticipated the complexity that civilian hostages added to the equation. The attackers began executing hostages with systematic efficiency, starting with the group nearest the entrance. Maya could hear the rapid percussion of gunfire and the screams of people who had become casualties in someone else's political war. The federal team was advancing with professional competence, but their progress was measured in seconds while the executions were happening in real time. Maya's scope found the attacker who was methodically killing people in the adult hostage group. No hesitation this time, no philosophical considerations about the moral implications of using lethal force. This was the situation she'd been trained for, the moment when precision under pressure meant the difference between protecting innocent life and watching helpless people die for reasons that had nothing to do with their individual choices or actions. She took the shot. The rifle's recoil was familiar against her shoulder, a controlled explosion that translated human decision into kinetic energy traveling at 2,800 feet per second across the space between moral intention and physical result. The 175-grain bullet found its target with the mathematical precision of physics applied through human skill, and the attacker who had been executing hostages dropped to the marble floor like a discarded mannequin. Maya worked the bolt action with fluid efficiency, chambering a second round while her scope searched for the next target. The tactical situation had changed now. She was no longer an observer, but a participant. No longer a civilian barista, but a Marine providing overwatch for a federal assault operation. The attackers would be looking for her position, trying to identify the source of accurate fire that had eliminated one of their team members. But Maya had advantages that her military training had taught her to recognize and exploit. She was shooting from an unexpected position that the attackers hadn't secured. She had superior optics and a precision rifle designed for exactly this kind of engagement, and she had the psychological advantage of surprise. The attackers were dealing with multiple threats simultaneously, and their tactical attention was divided between the federal assault team and an unknown sniper who had just demonstrated professional capabilities. Her second shot eliminated the attacker who was positioning to execute the group of children and elderly hostages. The bullet took him center mass, the impact spinning him away from his intended victims with the violent efficiency of modern ballistics applied through precision marksmanship. Maya worked the bolt action, muscle memory overriding conscious thought as she searched for additional targets. The leader had identified her general position now. She could see him directing 2 of his remaining team members toward the coffee cart area while he maintained control over the primary hostage group. Smart tactics, Maya acknowledged with professional respect for an opponent who understood the principles of fire and maneuver under pressure. But his team was now reduced to 5 effective personnel, while the federal assault team was pressing their advantage with the methodical aggression of professionals who had trained for exactly this scenario. Maya's third shot was more difficult, a target moving between cover positions, requiring her to lead the movement and time the shot for the moment when her target would be exposed in a predictable location. The bullet caught the attacker just as he was attempting to reach a position
where he could provide covering fire for his teammates' advance toward Maya's position. Professional shot placement that eliminated a threat while minimizing the risk of collateral damage from missed rounds in a crowded environment. But now Maya faced the tactical problem that had ended her military career. The remaining attackers were using hostages as human shields, positioning themselves where any shot that targeted them would risk hitting innocent people. The federal assault team was close enough to engage with precision weapons, but the attackers were prepared to execute hostages faster than law enforcement could neutralize them. Maya's scope found the leader through the crowd of terrified civilians. He was holding a pistol to Mrs. Patterson's head while shouting demands that Maya couldn't fully understand from her position. Mrs. Patterson looked impossibly fragile in the context of armed violence, her carefully maintained dignity reduced to the trembling vulnerability of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the world sometimes became inexplicably cruel without warning or explanation. The shot would have to be perfect. No margin for error, no second chance if her calculations were incomplete or her execution was flawed. The kind of precision that had once been routine for Maya before she'd learned that even perfect shots could have consequences that perfect training couldn't anticipate. Maya's finger found the trigger again, and she realized that this moment, this choice between action and inaction, between accepting responsibility for violence and allowing violence to happen through her failure to act, was exactly the same choice she'd faced in Kandahar. The variables were different, the tactical situation was different, but the essential human decision remained unchanged. Was she willing to use lethal force to protect innocent life, even knowing that such decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives? Through her scope, Maya could see Mrs. Patterson's eyes, wide with terror, but somehow still maintaining the dignity that had characterized her daily visits to the coffee cart. She could see the leader's finger tightening on his trigger, could calculate the precise moment when hesitation would become complicity in murder. Maya took the shot. The bullet traveled the distance between moral decision and physical result in less time than conscious thought required to process the implications. The leader dropped instantly, his weapon falling away from Mrs. Patterson's head as muscle control ceased with the catastrophic damage that high-velocity projectiles inflicted on human nervous systems. But Maya's celebration was interrupted by the sound of return fire from the last 2 attackers who had identified her position and were attempting to eliminate the sniper who had systematically destroyed their operational capabilities. Bullets struck the coffee cart with the metallic percussion of small arms fire against improvised cover, sending fragments of ceramic and metal ricocheting through the air in dangerous patterns that reminded Maya why combat veterans learned to distinguish between cover that stopped bullets and concealment that only blocked vision. The federal assault team used Maya's suppression of the remaining attackers to advance to positions where they could engage with minimal risk to the surviving hostages. Maya heard the familiar percussion of tactical teams neutralizing opposition with professional efficiency, followed by the shouted commands that indicated the immediate threat had been eliminated and the scene was being secured for medical and investigative personnel. The great clock above the station's main concourse showed 3:31 p.m. when the shooting stopped. 14 minutes from the first gunshot to the final silence, though Maya knew that those 14 minutes would expand in her memory to encompass lifetimes of tactical decisions and their consequences.
She set the rifle down with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months, and realized that she was still alive, that Mrs. Patterson was still alive, that 237 people would be going home to their families because someone had been willing to make difficult decisions under pressure. But she also realized that Detective Rodriguez was among the casualties, that at least 6 hostages had been killed during the initial phase of the assault, that her intervention had saved lives but hadn't prevented the tragedy from claiming innocent victims who had started their day expecting nothing more than catching a train or buying coffee.
Maya stood slowly, her hands raised to indicate her non-combative status to the federal agents who would be securing the scene. She could hear sirens approaching, could see emergency medical personnel beginning to treat the wounded, could observe the organized chaos that followed successful tactical operations as professionals worked to transition from combat to consequence management. Giuseppe's rifle lay disassembled on the floor behind the coffee cart, returned to components that looked harmless now that their lethal purpose had been fulfilled. Maya knew that federal investigators would want to understand how a former Marine with a civilian job had happened to be armed with a precision rifle during a terrorist attack, would need to verify that her actions had been legally justified rather than vigilante violence. But Maya also knew that she would sleep better tonight than she had in months, because for the first time since Kandahar, her precision under pressure had protected innocent life without claiming it. The nightmares might continue, the consequences of her military service might follow her for the rest of her civilian life, but today she had been exactly the person that circumstances required her to be. Maya realized it. They always had been. The only difference was which capabilities circumstances required her to employ, and whether she was willing to accept the responsibilities that came with the power to influence life and death through precision under pressure. As federal agents approached her position with weapons drawn but not aimed, Maya understood that her 6 months of hiding from her military identity were over. The world had reminded her that sometimes coffee wasn't the most important crisis people faced, and that the skills she'd been trying to forget might be exactly the skills that innocent people needed someone to remember. The first federal agent to reach Maya's position was a woman in her 40s with the controlled movement of someone accustomed to post-combat situations, her weapon lowered but ready as she assessed the scene behind the coffee cart with professional thoroughness. Her nameplate read Torres, and her body armor bore the distinctive markings of FBI Hostage Rescue Team, the federal unit responsible for exactly the kind of tactical operation that had just concluded with mixed success in Union Station's main concourse. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to keep your hands visible and move slowly away from the weapon," Torres instructed, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone trained to manage potentially dangerous situations through clear communication rather than force. "Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Maya complied with the instructions, stepping carefully around the scattered coffee equipment while keeping her hands raised in the universal gesture of non-threatening cooperation. "I'm not injured," she replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected given the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "The rifle belongs to Giuseppe Marcelli, the previous owner of this coffee business. I'm Maya Chen, former Marine Corps, honorably discharged 6 months ago." Torres's expression shifted slightly at the mention of military service, but her tactical assessment continued with the systematic thoroughness that characterized professional law enforcement. She gestured for Maya to move toward a clear area where other agents could maintain visual contact while she conducted a preliminary interview, standard procedure for anyone found armed at the scene of a terrorist incident. "Former Marines don't exist," Torres observed with a slight smile that suggested familiarity with military culture. "Just Marines doing different jobs. Agent Maria Torres, FBI HRT. I need to ask you some questions about what happened here, but first I want you to know that preliminary assessment suggests your actions saved a significant number of lives." Maya felt an unexpected surge of relief at Torres's words, though she recognized that official vindication would require extensive investigation and review.
Federal agencies didn't typically offer immediate assessment of civilian use of lethal force, but the circumstances of this incident were sufficiently extraordinary that normal protocols were apparently being adapted to fit unprecedented situations. Detective Rodriguez, he was among the hostages, tried to de-escalate early in the situation. I heard him being assaulted by the attackers but couldn't see his condition from my position.
Torres spoke briefly into her radio, requesting medical status updates on law enforcement casualties, then returned her attention to Maya with the focused intensity of someone gathering critical information under time pressure. Rodriguez is alive, conscious, being treated for head trauma and possible concussion. He's been asking about the sniper who provided overwatch during the assault, wants to thank whoever was providing precision fire support. The medical personnel had established a triage area near the station's east entrance, where Maya could see EMTs working with systematic efficiency to treat both gunshot casualties and people suffering from shock or injuries sustained during the chaotic minutes when the assault teams had breached the station. She counted at least 12 ambulances, their red and blue lights creating a kaleidoscope effect against the marble walls that had witnessed more violence in the past hour than they had in the previous century of peaceful train departures and arrivals. But Maya's attention was drawn to a familiar figure being helped toward one of the ambulances. Mrs. Patterson, moving slowly but under her own power, supported by a paramedic who was speaking to her in the gentle tones reserved for elderly trauma victims who had survived experiences that would challenge the coping capabilities of people half their age. Mrs. Patterson's sweater was torn and dirty, her carefully maintained dignity disrupted by the reality of having a gun held to her head by someone willing to kill her for political reasons she had never been party to. "Mrs. Patterson," Maya called out, ignoring Torres's instruction to remain in position. "Are you all right?" The elderly woman turned at the sound of Maya's voice, her eyes focusing with the effort of someone whose world had been violently disrupted and was now trying to re-establish connection with familiar elements of her daily routine. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by an expression of gratitude that was more profound than anything Maya had ever seen in response to perfectly prepared coffee. "Maya," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying clearly across the organized chaos of the crime scene. "You saved my life. That man, he was going to... but then he just collapsed and I knew someone was watching out for me." She paused, studying Maya's face with the careful attention of someone who had just realized that the quiet woman who made her coffee every morning was capable of precision violence when circumstances required it. "You were the one shooting, weren't you?" Maya nodded, understanding that denial would be both pointless and disrespectful to someone who deserved honest answers after surviving such trauma. "I'm sorry you had to experience that, Mrs. Patterson. No one should have to go through what happened here today." "Child," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I'm 73 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 4 children, and lived through enough of life's complications to understand that sometimes the world requires people to do difficult things in order to protect those who can't protect themselves. What you did was not something to apologize for. It was something to be grateful for." Torres had been listening to this exchange with the attentiveness of someone whose professional responsibilities included assessing the psychological state of both potential witnesses and people who had used lethal force in crisis situations. Maya could see her making mental notes that would become part of the official investigation, but also evaluating whether Maya represented a threat that required immediate attention or a resource that might provide valuable intelligence about the incident. "Mrs. Patterson," Torres interjected gently, "I'm going to need to speak with you about what you observed during the incident, but right now the paramedics want to get you to the hospital for evaluation. We'll have someone contact you tomorrow to schedule a formal interview when you've had time to rest and process what happened." As Mrs. Patterson was helped into the ambulance, Maya found herself surrounded by federal investigators who approached her with the systematic thoroughness of people trained to reconstruct complex incidents through methodical collection of physical evidence and witness testimony. The rifle components were photographed, measured,
and cataloged with the precision that characterized federal forensic investigations. Shell casings were located and marked, bullet trajectories were calculated using laser measurement equipment, and the entire area behind the coffee cart was processed as a crime scene. But Maya was most impressed by the agent who introduced himself as Special Agent James Morrison, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, whose responsibility apparently included psychological assessment of people who had used lethal force during crisis situations. Morrison approached her with the careful professionalism of someone accustomed to interviewing individuals whose actions during high-stress incidents might require extensive analysis to distinguish between justified defensive measures and problematic use of force. "Miss Chen," Morrison began, settling into a chair that had been positioned to facilitate conversation rather than interrogation, "I want to begin by acknowledging that preliminary assessments suggest your actions prevented significant loss of life. The tactical situation was developing in ways that would have resulted in mass casualties if the attackers had been allowed to proceed with their execution protocol. Your intervention disrupted their operational timeline and created opportunities for our assault team to engage with minimal risk to hostages." Maya appreciated Morrison's direct approach, though she recognized that his positive assessment was preliminary and subject to revision based on more detailed investigation. Federal agencies didn't typically offer immediate vindication of civilian use of lethal force, but the extraordinary circumstances of this incident apparently warranted deviation from standard protocols. "I understand that your actions will be subject to extensive review," Maya replied, maintaining the formal tone that seemed appropriate for official interviews. "I am prepared to cooperate fully with whatever investigation is necessary. I want to be clear that I acted based on my assessment of immediate threat to innocent life, not from any desire to engage in vigilante justice or take revenge against people who had attacked American civilians." Morrison nodded, making notes on a tablet that Maya assumed was recording their conversation for later transcription and analysis. "Your military record indicates specialized training in precision marksmanship and urban combat operations. Can you describe your thought process during the incident, particularly the tactical factors that influenced your decision to engage the attackers?" Maya spent the next 45 minutes providing detailed explanation of her tactical assessment, decision-making process, and the specific factors that had led her to conclude that intervention was necessary to prevent mass casualties. Morrison's questions were thorough but not hostile, focusing on her evaluation of threat levels, consideration of collateral damage potential, and the timing of her decision to engage rather than continue observing. But the most significant revelation came when Morrison showed her photographs of the attackers' equipment and documentation that had been recovered during the post-incident investigation. The weapons were military-grade, the communication equipment was sophisticated enough to suggest state sponsorship, and the operational planning documents indicated that this had been intended as the first of several coordinated attacks on American transportation infrastructure. "The intelligence community has been tracking this particular cell for 8 months, Morrison explained, showing Maya satellite photographs and surveillance records that painted a picture of extensive preparation and professional capabilities. They've been responsible for similar operations in 3 European countries, with casualty totals that suggest they were prepared to accept significant loss of life in pursuit of their political objectives." Maya studied the photographs with the analytical skills that her military training had developed for threat assessment and enemy capability evaluation. The attackers had been professionals, equipped with weapons and tactical gear that indicated substantial financial backing and access to military-grade equipment. Their operational security had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection by federal counterterrorism efforts until they were actually initiating their attack. "The tactical assessment that led to your intervention was correct," Morrison continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone whose professional expertise included evaluation of combat decision-making under pressure. "Computer modeling based on the attacker's documented procedures suggests that without your intervention, casualty estimates would have exceeded 50 dead and more than 100 wounded. Your actions changed the tactical equation in ways that prevented this from becoming one of the worst terrorist incidents in American history. But Maya's satisfaction at this vindication was complicated by the realization that 6 people had still died during the incident, including 3 children who had been executed during the initial phase of the assault before she'd been able to engage effectively. Her precision under pressure
Had saved lives, but it hadn't prevented the tragedy from claiming innocent victims, whose deaths would weigh on her conscience regardless of official assessment of her tactical performance. The people who died, Maya said, her voice carrying the weight of responsibility that she had learned to associate with combat operations where perfect solutions weren't available. Could different timing or tactical choices on my part have prevented those casualties? Morrison's response was immediate and professionally authoritative. Negative. The casualties occurred during the initial phase of the assault, before you had adequate intelligence about the tactical situation or clear-shot opportunities that wouldn't have risked additional collateral damage. Your engagement timing was optimal given the information available to you and the developing tactical situation. The official vindication was professionally satisfying, but Maya understood that emotional resolution would require more time and more complicated processing than federal investigation could provide. She'd prevented a massacre, but she'd also killed 4 people whose deaths would follow her into whatever civilian life she attempted to rebuild after today's events. The precision that had saved Mrs. Patterson's life had also ended the lives of people who had probably started their day with no intention of dying in Union Station during a political protest that had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. Giuseppe arrived at the station 3 hours after the incident had concluded, moving through the federal crime scene with the patient determination of someone who understood that bureaucratic procedures took precedence over personal relationships when national security was involved. Maya watched him approach through the window of the FBI Mobile Command Unit, where she'd been providing detailed testimony about her actions, and realized that his expression carried relief rather than surprise at discovering that his former employee had been involved in armed violence. "You used the rifle," Giuseppe said, when Torres finally allowed him to speak with Maya, his statement delivered with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had anticipated exactly this possibility when he'd left the weapon in the coffee cart storage compartment. "You knew something like this might happen," Maya replied, though it wasn't really a question. Giuseppe's preparation had been too thorough, too specific to current threats, for his rifle to have been simply general protection against random crime. Giuseppe settled into the chair that Morrison had vacated, his weathered hands folded in his lap with the patient composure of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for months. "My son works for Department of Homeland Security, Intelligence Analysis Division. For 6 months he has been warning me about increased chatter regarding attacks on transportation infrastructure. When I met you, when I learned about your military background and your difficulties adjusting to civilian life, I thought perhaps God was providing a solution to a problem that was bigger than one old man with a coffee cart." Maya stared at Giuseppe with the growing realization that her employment at the coffee cart had been something more than coincidence, that her months of civilian routine had been carefully orchestrated by someone who understood both her capabilities and the potential threats that those capabilities might be needed to address. "You've been preparing me," she said, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night of confusion. The precision training with the espresso machine, the routine that kept my hand steady, the location of the cart that provided overwatch of the entire station. You were getting me ready for today. Giuseppe's smile was sad but proud, the expression of someone who had accepted responsibility for orchestrating events that he'd hoped would never be necessary, but had prepared for with the thoroughness that characterized people who understood the difference between wishful thinking and realistic preparation. "The coffee business, she was real. Your skill, your dedication, your kindness to customers, all real. But yes, I was also preparing you to be the person that circumstances might require you to be. America has many enemies now, and not all of them wear uniforms or attack military targets. Sometimes the protection of innocent people requires someone who understands both precision and sacrifice." Maya felt the weight of months of manipulation settling over her like a heavy coat, but also the recognition that Giuseppe's deception had been motivated by love rather than exploitation. He had seen a broken Marine struggling with civilian life and had provided both healing and purpose, creating circumstances where her military skills could be preserved and channeled toward protection rather than destruction.
The nightmares, Maya said, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden from her conscious understanding. You knew about Kandahar, about why I left the military. My son's security clearance gives him access to personnel files for people who might be useful in counter-terrorism operations, Giuseppe replied, his honesty complete now that circumstances had made continued deception impossible. We knew about your exemplary service record, your specialized training, your psychological difficulties following the incident that led to your discharge. We also knew that the best therapy for combat veterans is often the opportunity to use their skills in service of protection rather than destruction. Maya's anger at being manipulated was balanced by gratitude for the healing that Giuseppe's careful orchestration had provided. The routine that had kept her hands steady, the social connections that had rebuilt her confidence in civilian relationships, the sense of purpose that had replaced the emptiness of medical discharge, all of these had been real, even if their foundation had been built on deception. Today's events will likely lead to reassessment of your civilian status, Morrison interjected, returning to the conversation with documentation that Maya recognized as military personnel files. Your actions have attracted attention from federal agencies that specialize in granting individuals with your particular combination of skills and psychological profile. There may be opportunities to serve your country in capacities that utilize your military training while providing the kind of support structure that facilitates successful reintegration into operational status. Maya looked at the documents that Morrison was offering, understanding that they represented a return to the world of classified operations and tactical missions that she'd been trying to leave behind when she'd traded her uniform for an apron and her rifle for an espresso machine. But she also understood that today's events had demonstrated that her attempts to separate her civilian identity from her military capabilities had been both unrealistic and potentially irresponsible. The world required people who could make difficult decisions under pressure, who could use precision violence to protect innocent life when circumstances left no alternatives. Maya had spent 6 months trying to convince herself that she could be someone other than the person her training had created, but Mrs. Patterson was alive because Giuseppe had refused to accept that transformation as permanent. I need time to think, Maya said, though she already knew what her decision would be. The woman who served coffee and the woman who carried a rifle were the same person, and trying to deny that reality had been a luxury that today's events had rendered impossible. The sun was setting through Union Station's great windows when Maya was finally released from federal custody. Her official status changed from potential suspect to protected witness in an ongoing investigation of international terrorism. The coffee cart remained behind police tape, its cheerful sunflower decorations now incongruous with the crime scene markers that documented the locations where precision violence had intersected with ordinary Tuesday afternoon routines. But Maya knew she wouldn't be returning to the coffee business, regardless of what career decisions she ultimately made. Today had reminded her that some skills carried responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned simply because the emotional cost of using them had proven higher than anticipated. The world required people who could make difficult decisions under pressure, who could use precision violence to protect innocent life when circumstances left no alternatives. Maya had spent 6 months trying to convince herself that she could be someone other than the person her training had created, but Mrs. Patterson was alive because Giuseppe had refused to accept that transformation as permanent. 6 weeks after the Union Station incident, Maya Chen stood in a classroom at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, facing 23 federal agents who had been selected for specialized training in counterterrorism response and civilian protection protocols. The students represented multiple agencies: FBI, Secret Service, ATF, Homeland Security,
united by their responsibility for preventing and responding to the kind of coordinated attacks that had transformed Union Station into a battlefield for 14 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The most critical factor in effective crisis response, Maya was explaining, her voice carrying across the classroom with the confidence that came from teaching material she had learned
through experience rather than textbooks, is the ability to make accurate tactical assessments under time pressure while maintaining awareness of civilian protection requirements. Military training prepares us to neutralize threats efficiently, but federal law enforcement adds the complexity of preserving evidence, minimizing collateral damage, and maintaining operational legitimacy in situations where every decision will be subject to extensive legal and media scrutiny. The classroom was equipped with advanced simulation technology that allowed students to experience modified versions of real-world scenarios, including a detailed recreation of the Union Station incident that had been constructed from security footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. Maya had initially resisted participating in the simulation exercises, finding it emotionally difficult to relive the tactical decisions that had saved lives but also claimed them. But she'd gradually come to understand that teaching others required her to transform personal trauma into professional expertise. Agent Martinez, Maya addressed one of the students, a DEA agent whose background included urban tactical operations. Walk me through your assessment of shot placement priorities if you were positioned behind cover with clear line of sight to multiple targets who were using human shields. Martinez stood, consulting the tablet that displayed the tactical scenario parameters, his response demonstrating the kind of systematic thinking that separated competent agents from exceptional ones. Primary consideration would be target isolation, identifying opportunities when attackers were separated from hostages by sufficient distance to minimize collateral damage risk. Secondary consideration would be target priority based on immediate threat assessment and operational command structure. Correct tactical framework, Maya acknowledged, but incomplete emotional preparation. When you're looking through a scope at someone who has a gun to an elderly woman's head, your brain doesn't process target isolation and threat assessment. It processes, Mrs. Patterson is about to die unless I make a perfect shot right now. The technical training is essential, but psychological preparation for the human cost of precision under pressure is what separates successful operations from tragic mistakes. Maya's transition from coffee cart operator to federal training instructor had been facilitated by the same Department of Homeland Security connections that Giuseppe had used to orchestrate her employment at Union Station. The federal agencies responsible for counterterrorism operations had recognized that Maya's unique combination of military expertise and recent civilian experience provided valuable perspective on the psychological challenges that agents faced when transitioning between routine law enforcement and combat operations. But Maya's real motivation for accepting the teaching position had been her recognition that the skills that had saved lives at Union Station needed to be preserved and transmitted to people who might face similar situations in the future. The terrorist cell that had attacked Union Station had been part of a larger network that remained active, and intelligence assessments suggested that transportation infrastructure would continue to be a primary target for coordinated attacks designed to maximize civilian casualties and psychological impact. The Union Station incident has become a case study in federal training curricula, Special Agent Morrison had explained during Maya's recruitment interview, because it demonstrates both the effectiveness of precision intervention and the psychological complexity of civilian protection operations. Your willingness to share your experience could prevent similar incidents from escalating beyond law enforcement's ability to control. Maya had accepted the position not from any desire to return to military service, but from understanding that her civilian life had been permanently altered by the recognition that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned simply because they carried emotional costs. The woman who had served coffee for 6 months had been the same person who had assembled Giuseppe's rifle in 15 seconds when circumstances required precision under pressure. And attempting to deny that reality had proven both impossible and potentially irresponsible.
The teaching position had also provided Maya with access to counseling services that were specifically designed for federal personnel who had used lethal force in civilian protection operations.
The therapists who worked with federal agents understood the psychological complexity of situations where preventing tragedy required causing trauma, where protecting innocent life required taking guilty life, where precision under pressure carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. The nightmares don't stop, Dr. Sarah Williams had explained during Maya's first counseling session, her tone carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had spent years helping federal agents process the emotional aftermath of justified violence. But they change character over time, becoming less about guilt and more about responsibility. The goal isn't to forget what you've done. It's to integrate those experiences into a coherent sense of identity that allows you to continue functioning effectively while carrying appropriate emotional weight for decisions that involved life and death. Maya's therapy had focused on developing coping strategies that acknowledged rather than denied the moral complexity of her actions at Union Station. She had killed 4 people whose deaths had been tactically necessary but emotionally complicated. People who had probably been motivated by political beliefs rather than simple criminal intent, whose families would grieve their loss regardless of the circumstances that had made their deaths operationally required. But Maya had also saved Mrs. Patterson, Detective Rodriguez, and potentially dozens of other people who would have been executed if she had chosen emotional safety over tactical intervention. The mathematics of her decision-making had been clear. More lives saved than lives lost. But the emotional calculus had proven more complicated than simple arithmetic could encompass. The breakthrough in Maya's psychological adjustment had come during her 4th month of teaching, when one of her students had asked a question that forced her to articulate the philosophical framework that justified precision violence in civilian protection contexts. Instructor Chen, Agent Sarah Kim, had asked during a discussion of ethical considerations in federal operations, "How do you reconcile the moral prohibition against taking human life with the operational requirement to use lethal force when protecting innocent people?" Maya's answer had surprised her with its clarity and conviction. The moral prohibition against taking life includes the responsibility to protect innocent life when you have the capability to do so. Choosing emotional comfort over tactical intervention when people are being murdered isn't moral. It's cowardice disguised as ethics. The weight of taking life is the price we pay for the privilege of saving life, and people who aren't willing to pay that price shouldn't be in positions where such decisions are required. The breakthrough in Maya's psychological adjustment had crystallized her understanding of her own experience and had provided the foundation for her continued work in federal training programs. She had found purpose not in forgetting her military capabilities, but in using them responsibly in service of protection rather than destruction, in teaching others to carry the emotional weight of precision under pressure while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for effective performance. Giuseppe had visited Maya at Quantico during her 2nd month of teaching, bringing coffee from his new shop in Sicily and the patient satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated events according to a plan that had ultimately achieved its intended objectives. "You are where you belong," he had observed, watching Maya conduct a training exercise that simulated the tactical challenges of urban counterterrorism operations. Not because you were destined for this work, but because you chose to accept the responsibilities that your capabilities create. The difference between those two things is what separates people who serve from people who simply follow orders. Maya's relationship with Giuseppe had evolved from resentment over his manipulation to gratitude for his wisdom in recognizing that healing sometimes required purpose rather than simple rest. He had understood that her psychological wounds had been caused not by military service itself, but by the conflict between her sense of responsibility and her desire to avoid the emotional costs that responsibility entailed. "The coffee business was never about coffee," Giuseppe had continued, his accent softening as emotion as he spoke about decisions that had proven more consequential than he had initially anticipated. "Was about giving you time to remember who you are, underneath the person you were trying to become.
The Marine who saved those people at Union Station was always there, waiting for circumstances that required her to emerge. Maya's teaching responsibilities had gradually expanded beyond tactical training to include psychological preparation for federal agents who were transitioning from routine law enforcement to specialized operations that might require lethal force. The Union Station incident
had demonstrated that terrorists were increasingly targeting civilian infrastructure in ways that required law enforcement to function as de facto military units, operating under rules of engagement that were more complex than either traditional police work or conventional military operations. Federal agents today need to be prepared for situations that didn't exist 20 years ago, Maya explained to a new class of students during their orientation briefing. You might start your day serving warrants for white-collar crime and end it engaging armed terrorists who are executing hostages in shopping malls or schools or transportation hubs. The psychological agility required to transition between those operational contexts while maintaining both tactical effectiveness and legal compliance is what we're here to develop. But Maya's most significant contribution to federal training programs had been her development of simulation exercises that accurately reproduced the psychological pressure of civilian protection operations. Working with behavioral psychologists and tactical experts, she had created training scenarios that challenged students to make life-and-death decisions under time pressure while processing the emotional weight of knowing that their choices would determine whether innocent people lived or died. The goal isn't to desensitize you to violence, Maya emphasized during debriefing sessions that followed the intense simulation exercises. The goal is to train you to function effectively while remaining emotionally connected to the human consequences of your decisions. Agents who stop caring about the people they're protecting become risks to the operations they're conducting and to the communities they're serving. Detective Rodriguez had visited Maya at Quantico 6 months after the Union Station incident. His recovery from the head trauma he'd sustained complete enough to allow him to return to active duty with the Metropolitan Police Department. His visit had been motivated partly by gratitude for Maya's intervention, but primarily by his interest in the training programs that federal agencies were developing to prepare law enforcement for coordinated terrorist attacks. Local police are increasingly finding ourselves in situations where federal-level threats intersect with community-level responsibilities, Rodriguez had explained during his visit to Maya's classroom. The criminals we're dealing with have access to military-grade equipment and training, but we are still expected to operate according to community policing principles that prioritize de-escalation and minimal force. Maya's training helps bridge that gap by teaching tactical effectiveness within legal and ethical frameworks that protect both officers and civilians. Maya's conversation with Rodriguez had reminded her that the Union Station incident had implications beyond her personal psychological journey. The attack had been part of a larger pattern of terrorism that specifically targeted civilian infrastructure, attempting to create fear and disruption that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Federal response to such threats required coordination between agencies that had traditionally operated independently, sharing intelligence and tactical resources in ways that challenged established bureaucratic boundaries. Your intervention at Union Station didn't just save lives that day, Rodriguez had continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years observing the intersection of crime and community. It demonstrated that effective counterterrorism requires people who can think tactically while acting within legal constraints, who can use military skills for civilian protection rather than enemy destruction. The training you're providing here could prevent similar incidents from escalating beyond local law enforcement's ability to handle.
Maya's work at Quantico had gradually attracted attention from international law enforcement agencies that were facing similar challenges in preparing for terrorist attacks on civilian targets. Representatives from British, French, German, and Israeli counterterrorism units had visited her training facilities, sharing intelligence about terrorist tactics while learning from American innovations in federal response protocols. Terrorism is an international problem that requires international solutions, Maya had explained to a delegation of European security officials who were observing her training exercises. The skills and psychological preparation that prevented mass casualties at Union Station are relevant anywhere that law enforcement might be required to engage trained adversaries who are using civilian populations as tactical cover. But Maya's most profound personal growth had come through her developing relationship with Mrs. Patterson, who had become a regular visitor to Maya's apartment in Quantico and a source of perspective that balanced the tactical focus of her professional life with reminders of the human values that justified precision under pressure.
"You saved my life," Mrs. Patterson had said during one of their monthly dinners, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had processed her trauma through months of counseling and reflection. "But more than that, you reminded me that there are still people in the world who are willing to risk themselves to protect strangers. In a time when it's easy to believe that everyone is looking out only for themselves, your actions restored my faith in human decency." Maya's friendship with Mrs. Patterson had provided emotional anchoring that prevented her federal work from becoming purely tactical, reminding her that the techniques she was teaching and the operations she was preparing for ultimately served people like Mrs. Patterson, ordinary citizens who deserved to live their lives without fear of random violence, who had the right to expect protection from people with the capability to provide it. "The young man who tried to be a hero early in the incident," Mrs. Patterson had continued, referring to the first hostage who had been killed when he'd attempted to resist the attackers, "he had courage but not skill. You had both courage and skill, which made your courage effective rather than tragic. That's why what you're doing now matters. You're teaching other people to be courageously effective rather than courageously dead." Maya's relationship with Mrs. Patterson had also provided insight into the long-term psychological impact of terrorist incidents on civilian populations. Mrs. Patterson had required months of therapy to process the trauma of having a gun held to her head, of witnessing multiple murders, of experiencing the particular helplessness that came from being used as a human shield in someone else's political war. The nightmares were the worst part, Mrs. Patterson had shared during one of their conversations about recovery and resilience. Not just dreams about what happened, but dreams about what could have happened if you hadn't been there, if your aim had been slightly off, if the situation had developed differently. Survivor's guilt is complicated when you know exactly how close you came to not surviving. But Mrs. Patterson's recovery had also demonstrated the resilience that ordinary people could develop when they received appropriate support and were allowed to process their experiences without shame or pressure to get over trauma that had legitimate psychological impact. Her return to daily routines, her willingness to use public transportation again, her gradual restoration of trust in her personal safety, all of these had shown Maya that effective counterterrorism included helping victims recover from successful attacks as much as preventing unsuccessful ones. "You gave me my life back twice," Mrs. Patterson had told Maya during their most recent dinner. "Once when you shot that man who was going to kill me, and again when you showed me that my trauma was normal, that healing was possible, that I didn't have to be ashamed of being afraid after experiencing something that was legitimately terrifying." Maya's work at Quantico had evolved to include victim services training for federal agents, teaching them to understand the psychological needs of people who had survived terrorist attacks and to provide support that facilitated recovery rather than re-traumatization. This training had grown out of Maya's recognition that effective counterterrorism required attention to aftermath as much as prevention,
helping communities heal from successful attacks while preparing to prevent future ones. 18 months after the Union Station incident, Maya received notification that the international terrorist network responsible for the attack had been dismantled through coordinated operations conducted by American, European, and Middle Eastern law enforcement agencies. The intelligence that had been gathered during the Union Station investigation had provided crucial information about the network's structure, funding sources, and operational planning that had enabled successful interventions before additional attacks to be executed. Your actions at Union Station provided more than immediate tactical success, Morrison had explained during a briefing that updated Maya on the broader implications of her intervention. The survivors who were captured provided intelligence that has prevented an estimated 12 additional attacks on civilian targets across 4 countries. The techniques you used and the training programs you've developed have been shared with allied agencies and have improved international counterterrorism capabilities.
Maya had received this information with the satisfaction that came from understanding that her personal trauma had contributed to broader efforts to protect innocent people from political violence. The 4 lives she had taken at Union Station had been justified not only by the immediate protection they had provided to hostages, but by the intelligence and tactical innovations that had prevented much larger casualties in subsequent operations. But Maya's greatest source of personal satisfaction had been the letter she received from Giuseppe's son, who worked in the Department of Homeland Security Intelligence Division and who had been instrumental in orchestrating the circumstances that had placed Maya in position to intervene at Union Station. My father's assessment of your character and capabilities has been validated by events, the letter had stated. But more importantly, your willingness to transform personal trauma into professional expertise that serves others has demonstrated the kind of moral courage that effective counterterrorism requires. The people you have trained at Quantico will carry your knowledge and wisdom into situations where precision under pressure will mean the difference between tragedy and salvation. 2 years after Union Station, Maya had been promoted to Director of Tactical Psychology for the FBI's Counterterrorism Training Division, a position that recognized her unique combination of military expertise, civilian experience, and psychological insight into the challenges that federal agents faced when transitioning between routine law enforcement and combat operations. Her programs had been adopted by federal agencies throughout the United States and had been shared with allied nations as part of international cooperation in counterterrorism efforts. But Maya's most important personal achievement had been her successful integration of her military identity with her civilian values, accepting that the woman who had served coffee and the woman who carried a rifle were the same person, that her capabilities created responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned simply because they carried emotional costs. Precision under pressure, Maya had written in the training manual that had become required reading for federal agents throughout the country, is not about eliminating emotion from tactical decision-making. It's about channeling emotion toward protection rather than destruction, toward service rather than self-interest, toward accepting the weight of consequences that follow from choosing to act when action is required to protect innocent life. Maya Chen had learned to sleep peacefully again, not because she had forgotten what she had done at Union Station, but because she had transformed that experience into service that honored both the lives she had taken and the lives she had saved. The coffee cart with sunflower decorations had been replaced by a classroom where future federal agents learned to carry the emotional weight of precision under pressure while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for protecting the people who depended on them to stand between innocence and violence. 5 years after Union Station, Maya Chen stood before the graduating class of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center's Advanced Counterterrorism Program, delivering the commencement address to 127 federal agents who would soon deploy to field assignments where the training they had received might determine
whether terrorist attacks succeeded or failed, whether innocent people lived or died, whether precision under pressure protected communities or failed them when protection was most needed. Today you become part of a thin blue line that most Americans never see, Maya began, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority that came from teaching materials she had learned through experience rather than textbooks. You will operate in the spaces between routine law enforcement and military operations, protecting civilian populations from threats that require both tactical expertise and legal precision. The skills you have developed here will serve you well, but the character you bring to using those skills will determine whether you succeed in serving the communities that depend on your willingness to stand between innocence and violence. The graduating agents represented the culmination of training programs that Maya had developed and refined over 5 years of teaching, incorporating lessons learned from the Union Station incident and dozens of subsequent operations where federal agents had successfully prevented or responded to terrorist attacks on American soil. Her methods had proven effective in preparing agents for the psychological complexity of civilian protection operations, teaching them to maintain both tactical competence and emotional resilience when facing situations where their decisions carried life and death consequences.
In the audience, Maya could see familiar faces that reminded her of the personal connections that had sustained her through the transition from military service to federal training responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson, now 81 years old, had traveled from her retirement community in Florida to attend the graduation ceremony, her presence serving as a reminder that effective counterterrorism ultimately served individual people rather than abstract policy objectives. Detective Rodriguez, recently promoted to captain in the Metropolitan Police Department, represented the local law enforcement agencies that increasingly collaborated with federal units in addressing terrorist threats that transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Giuseppe Marcelli had returned from Sicily for the graduation ceremony, bringing coffee from his new shop and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated events according to a long-term plan that had achieved objectives he had never explicitly stated but had always clearly understood. His presence reminded Maya that sometimes the most important interventions in people's lives came from individuals who were willing to accept responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond their immediate personal interests. Director Chen's training programs have been implemented by federal agencies throughout the United States and have been shared with allied nations as part of international cooperation in counterterrorism efforts, the FBI director had announced during the introduction that preceded Maya's address. Her work has contributed to the successful prevention of 47 planned terrorist attacks and has provided tactical training that has been credited with saving an estimated 3,400 lives during operations conducted by agents who received instruction through her programs. But Maya's attention was focused on the graduating agents rather than the administrative recognition of her professional achievements. These were people who would soon face situations similar to what she had experienced at Union Station, who would be required to make tactical decisions under pressure while maintaining awareness of legal constraints and emotional consequences that separated federal law enforcement from military operations. Their success would depend not only on the technical skills they had mastered, but on their psychological preparation for carrying the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond their individual survival. The Union Station incident taught me that precision under pressure is not a technical skill, it's a moral choice, Maya continued, her voice carrying the conviction that came from transforming personal trauma into professional wisdom. When you find yourself in a situation where innocent people depend on your willingness to act, where your tactical competence is the only thing standing between tragedy and salvation, you will discover that all your training ultimately serves a single purpose, giving you the capability to choose protection over self-preservation, service over safety, accepting the weight of consequences that follow from doing what is right
rather than what is easy. The speech concluded with Maya's traditional challenge to graduating agents, words that had become associated with her training programs and had been adopted by federal agencies as an unofficial motto for agents engaged in counterterrorism operations. Your precision serves protection. Your courage serves community. Your sacrifice serves strangers who will never know your name, but whose lives depend on your willingness to stand in the gap when the gap needs to be filled. After the ceremony, Maya found herself surrounded by graduating agents who wanted to thank her for training that had already proven valuable during their preliminary assignments. Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had successfully prevented a bombing at a shopping mall in Phoenix, credited Maya's psychological preparation techniques with helping her maintain tactical focus while processing the emotional weight of using lethal force to protect civilian shoppers. Agent Michael Torres, who had been part of a federal team that had disrupted a planned attack on a subway system in Chicago, emphasized that Maya's training in civilian protection protocols had enabled his team to neutralize threats while minimizing collateral damage in a crowded urban environment. But Maya's most meaningful conversation was with Agent Sarah Kim, the student who had asked the question about moral justification for lethal force that had helped Maya articulate her own philosophical framework for precision under pressure. Director Chen, Kim said, her voice carrying the confidence that came from 18 months of successful fieldwork following graduation from Maya's training program. I wanted you to know that your answer to my question about the ethics of lethal force has guided every
decision I've made since graduation. Understanding that the moral prohibition against taking life includes the responsibility to protect innocent life when you have the capability to do so, that framework has allowed me to act effectively while maintaining emotional connection to the human consequences of my decisions. Maya's satisfaction at Kim's words was complicated by recognition that her student would soon face situations that would test that philosophical framework in ways that training exercises could simulate, but not fully prepare anyone to experience. The psychological weight of taking human life in defense of innocent people was something that could be discussed and anticipated, but ultimately had to be carried by each individual according to their own capacity for accepting responsibility for consequences that extended beyond immediate tactical objectives. The weight never goes away, Maya replied, speaking from 5 years of experience in carrying the consequences of her actions at Union Station. But it becomes part of who you are, rather than something that fights against who you want to be. The goal isn't to eliminate the emotional cost of precision under pressure. It's to accept that cost as the price of the privilege of protecting people who can't protect themselves. 10 years after Union Station, Maya received a letter from a high school student in Denver whose life had been saved during a terrorist attack on her school by federal agents who had been trained through Maya's programs. The student, whose name was Aisha Morrison, she had been named after the Afghan girl whose death had haunted Maya's transition from military to civilian life, wanted to thank the woman whose training had enabled Agent Patricia Wong to neutralize armed attackers before they could execute their planned massacre of students and teachers. Agent Wong told me that her ability to make accurate tactical decisions under pressure while protecting innocent people came from training she received from Director Maya Chen. She said that Director Chen teaches federal agents to carry the emotional weight of violence while maintaining the psychological stability necessary for protecting communities. I wanted you to know that your training saved my life and the lives of 347 other students and teachers who were at risk during the attack on our school. Maya had read the letter multiple times before understanding the profound significance of the student's name. Aisha Morrison, named after the Afghan girl whose accidental death had ended Maya's military career, but alive because Maya's training had enabled effective intervention during a terrorist attack that could have claimed hundreds of lives. The symbolic completion was too perfect to be coincidental, too meaningful to be dismissed as random chance.
The letter had been accompanied by a photograph of Aisha Morrison receiving a scholarship to study international relations at Georgetown University, where she planned to focus on counterterrorism policy and conflict resolution. Her academic interests had been shaped by her experience during the school attack and by conversations with Agent Wong about the psychological complexity of civilian protection operations. I want to understand how societies can prevent political violence while maintaining respect for human rights, Aisha Morrison had written in her scholarship application essay, which Agent Wong had shared with Maya's permission. The federal agents who saved my school demonstrated that effective counterterrorism requires people who can think tactically while acting within legal and ethical frameworks that protect both communities and individual dignity. I want to contribute to developing policies that prevent terrorism while preserving the democratic values that make communities worth protecting. Maya's satisfaction at this news was complicated by the recognition that her work had come full circle, in ways that she could have never anticipated when she first assembled Giuseppe's rifle behind the coffee cart at Union Station. The skills that had once been associated with personal trauma had been transformed into institutional knowledge that was protecting communities throughout the United States and internationally, enabling effective intervention against terrorist threats while maintaining the legal and ethical standards that distinguish democratic societies from the authoritarian regimes that often sponsored terrorist operations. 15 years after Union Station, Maya Chen retired from federal service with the rank of Assistant Director for Training and Development, FBI Counterterrorism Division, her programs having been integrated into the standard curriculum for federal law enforcement agencies throughout the United States and allied nations. Her final official act was the presentation of training materials to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, enabling international law enforcement agencies to benefit from innovations in counterterrorism training that had been developed through American experience with domestic and international terrorist threats. But Maya's retirement was interrupted by a phone call from Giuseppe, now 93 years old and living with his daughter in Rome, who wanted to share news that he thought would interest the woman whose life he had changed through careful orchestration of circumstances that had seemed coincidental at the time.
"The coffee cart," Giuseppe said, his voice carrying clearly across the international phone connection despite his advanced age. "They have made it into a memorial. Union Station has preserved the cart exactly as it was after the incident, with a plaque that explains how an ordinary coffee vendor used extraordinary skills to protect innocent people when protection was needed. But Maya, they did not call you a coffee vendor. They called you a hero who happened to be serving coffee when heroism was required." Maya's response was complicated by emotions that she had not fully processed even after 15 years of successful integration of her military identity with her civilian values. The coffee cart had been the symbol of her attempt to escape from the responsibilities that her military training had created, but it had become the platform from which she had accepted those responsibilities in service of protection rather than destruction. "Giuseppe," Maya said, her voice carrying gratitude that had accumulated over years of understanding how his manipulation had transformed her psychological wounds into institutional knowledge that was protecting communities throughout the world. "Did you know when you hired me that Union Station would be attacked?" Giuseppe's laughter carried the warmth of someone who had lived long enough to understand that some questions were more important than their answers, that some mysteries were more valuable than their solutions. "Maya, my dear," Giuseppe replied, his accent unchanged by years and distance. "I knew that the world was becoming dangerous in ways that require good people to be prepared for bad situations. I knew that you were a good person who had been broken by circumstances that required you to use capabilities that civilians are not supposed to need. And I knew that healing sometimes requires purpose rather than rest. That strength sometimes comes from accepting responsibility rather than avoiding it."
But did you know, Maya pressed, wanting clarity about whether her presence at Union Station during the terrorist attack had been coincidence or orchestration? I knew that America had enemies who were planning attacks on civilian targets, Giuseppe replied, his honesty complete now that the statute of limitations had expired on whatever ethical compromises his orchestration might have involved. I knew that federal agencies had intelligence about increased threats to transportation infrastructure. And I knew that if such an attack occurred at Union Station, the response would be more effective if there was someone present who could think tactically while caring about civilian protection. Maya's final understanding was that Giuseppe had orchestrated circumstances that had prepared her to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills when those skills were needed to prevent tragedy, but that the specific timing and nature of the terrorist attack had been beyond his ability to predict or control. He had created conditions for effective intervention without knowing when or whether such intervention would be required. 20 years after Union Station, Maya Chen published her memoirs under the title Precision Under Pressure, From Coffee Cart to Counterterrorism, a book that became required reading in criminal justice programs throughout the United States and internationally. The book provided detailed analysis of the psychological challenges that military veterans faced when transitioning to civilian life, the tactical innovations that had emerged from federal counterterrorism training programs, and the philosophical framework that justified precision violence in civilian protection contexts. But the book's most significant contribution was its emphasis on the importance of preparation for scenarios that might never occur, the value of maintaining capabilities that might never be needed, and the responsibility that people with specialized skills bore for protecting communities that depended on their willingness to act when action was required. The question is not whether you will ever need to use military skills in civilian contexts. The question is whether you will be prepared to use those skills effectively if circumstances require them, whether you will have maintained both the technical competence and the psychological resilience necessary for protecting innocent people when protection requires precision under pressure. The book's success led to speaking engagements at universities, law enforcement academies, and military installations throughout the United States and internationally, where Maya shared her experience with audiences who were grappling with similar questions about the relationship between military capabilities and civilian responsibilities, between individual trauma and community service, between accepting the weight of violence and preserving the values that made violence worth carrying. 25 years after Union Station, Maya Chen received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of her contributions to American counterterrorism capabilities and her development of training programs that had been credited with preventing terrorist attacks and saving thousands of lives. The ceremony was attended by federal agents who had been trained through her programs, survivors of terrorist attacks who had been prevented through effective intervention, and family members of people whose lives had been saved by the institutional knowledge that Maya had developed through her willingness to transform personal trauma into professional expertise. But Maya's response to the presidential recognition was focused on the people whose lives had been touched by her work, rather than the administrative achievements that had earned official acknowledgement. This recognition belongs to the federal agents who have used their training to protect innocent people, to the survivors of terrorist attacks who have found strength to rebuild their lives, and to the communities that have supported both law enforcement and victims in their efforts to prevent and recover from political violence, Maya said during her acceptance speech. Individual heroism is less important than institutional capability, and institutional capability depends on ordinary people who are willing to accept extraordinary responsibilities when circumstances require them to do so. 30 years after Union Station, Maya Chen died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 84, having lived long enough to see counterterrorism training programs that she had developed become standard practice for federal law enforcement agencies throughout the democratic world. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of federal agents whose careers had been shaped by her training. survivors of terrorist attacks who had been protected by agents trained through her programs, and family members of people whose lives had been saved by the institutional knowledge that Maya had developed through her willingness to transform personal trauma into professional expertise. But Maya's most fitting memorial was the continued operation of training programs that carried her philosophical framework into new generations of federal agents who faced evolving terrorist threats with the psychological preparation and tactical competence that Maya had developed through her unique combination of military experience, civilian healing, and institutional innovation. The coffee cart remained on display at Union Station, its cheerful sunflower decorations now accompanied by a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Maya Chen, who served coffee for 6 months until her 15-second rifle assembly saved 200 hostages." Her precision under pressure reminds us that ordinary people with extraordinary skills carry extraordinary responsibilities for protecting the communities that depend on their willingness to act when action is required. Visitors to the memorial often paused to read testimonials from people whose lives had been saved by federal agents trained through Maya's programs. Stories that demonstrated the ongoing impact of one woman's decision to transform personal trauma into institutional capability that protected innocent people from political violence.
Agent Sarah Kim, now director of the FBI Counterterrorism Training Division, concluded the dedication ceremony for the expanded memorial with words that captured Maya's legacy. Director Chen taught us that precision under pressure is not about eliminating emotion from tactical decision-making. It's about channeling emotion toward protection rather than destruction, toward service rather than self-interest, toward accepting the weight of consequences that follow from choosing to act when action is required to protect innocent life. The memorial's final edition was a small espresso machine, maintained in working condition by volunteers who had been trained in Giuseppe's techniques for coffee preparation. Visitors could purchase coffee made according to the standards that Maya had learned during her 6 months of civilian life, with proceeds supporting scholarships from military veterans who were pursuing careers in federal law enforcement. On the wall behind the espresso machine, a simple inscription captured the essence of Maya's transformation from military service to civilian healing to federal training responsibilities, from precision in combat to precision in coffee to precision in training others. Maya Chen demonstrated that skills developed for war can be transformed into capabilities that serve peace, that individual trauma can become institutional wisdom, and that the willingness to carry the weight of violence can protect communities from the burden of fear. Giuseppe's final gift to Maya's memory was a letter that was opened on the 10th anniversary of her death, containing his last thoughts about the woman whose life he had changed through careful orchestration of circumstances that had seemed coincidental but had been guided by his understanding of how healing sometimes required purpose rather than simple rest. Maya, my dear, if you are reading this, then I am probably drinking espresso with my ancestors and arguing with them about whether manipulation in service of protection is morally justifiable or simply necessary. I hope you found peace in understanding that the woman who served coffee and the woman who carried a rifle were always the same person, that your capabilities created responsibilities that you ultimately accepted and transformed into service that honored both the lives you saved and the lives you took. The letter concluded with Giuseppe's assessment of Maya's legacy. You proved that broken does not mean worthless, that trauma can become wisdom, and that the highest form of courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when action serves something larger than ourselves. The final paragraph of his letter contained a revelation that Maya would never read, but that explained the profound interconnectedness of her journey. The 11-year-old girl in Afghanistan whose death haunted your dreams, Aisha, her family survived because of the intelligence your unit gathered during that mission. Her brothers grew up to become doctors, her sister became a teacher, her mother started a school for girls in Kandahar. Your precision under pressure in that moment, as painful as its consequences were, created ripples of protection that extended far beyond what you could see from your position. Years later, When Agent Sarah Kim discovered Giuseppe's letter among Maya's papers, she realized that Maya's story was not just about one woman's journey from trauma to healing to service. It was about the invisible connections that linked individual actions to community protection, the way that accepting responsibility for difficult decisions created opportunities for others to live safely in a world where safety was never guaranteed. The Maya Chen Counterterrorism Training Academy, established 5 years after her death, became the premier institution for preparing federal agents to face evolving terrorist threats with the psychological resilience and tactical competence that Maya had developed through her unique path from military service to civilian life to federal training responsibilities. On the wall behind the espresso machine, a simple inscription captured the essence of Maya's transformation from military service to civilian healing to federal training. From precision in combat, to precision in coffee, to precision in training others, Maya Chen demonstrated that skills developed for war can be transformed into capabilities that serve peace, that individual trauma can become institutional wisdom, and that the willingness to carry the weight of violence can protect communities from the burden of fear.
Pressure meant the difference between tragedy and salvation. Each successful intervention, each prevented attack, each life saved through effective tactical decision-making under pressure represented the ongoing impact of one woman's decision to transform personal trauma into institutional wisdom that protected communities from political violence. The coffee cart still operated at Union Station, now managed by a nonprofit organization that trained military veterans in business skills while providing them with structured environments for transitioning to civilian life. The sunflower decorations remained bright and cheerful, a reminder that ordinary places could become stages for extraordinary courage when circumstances required ordinary people to accept extraordinary responsibilities. Maya Chen had learned the deepest truth about healing. Sometimes the way forward leads not away from our wounds, but through them, towards service that transforms personal pain into protection for others. Her 15-second rifle assembly had saved 200 hostages, but her lifetime of training others had saved thousands more who would never know her name, but whose lives depended on her willingness to ensure that steady hands would be available when communities needed it most. In the end, Maya's greatest victory was not the terrorist attack she had stopped, but the institutional knowledge she had created to stop the attacks that came after. Thank you for listening to She Served Coffee for 6 months until her 15-second rifle assembly saved 200 hostages. If this story of courage, resilience, and transformation moved you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could hit that subscribe button right now. Your subscription helps me continue bringing you powerful stories of ordinary people who find extraordinary strength when the world needs them most. Stories like Maya's remind us that healing isn't always about moving past our experiences. Sometimes it's about moving through them towards service that honors both our struggles and our capabilities. Every week, I share narratives that explore the complex intersections of trauma and triumph, individual choice and community impact, the weight of responsibility and the power of military training. Don't miss the next story that might change how you see courage, service, or the hidden strength that exists within seemingly ordinary lives. Subscribe now and join a community of listeners who believe that the most powerful stories are often found in the spaces between heroism and humanity. Hit subscribe, share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those who seek them, but by those who are simply present when presence is required. Thank you for reading. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our incredible true stories.
What did you think of Maya's courage? Let me know in the comments below.